Modern men are emotionally domesticated. John Locke saw it coming. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. John Locke wrote these words in his second treatise of government, not realizing he was prophesying the most insidious form of subjugation modern men would face. Not political tyranny, but emotional domestication. Look around you. The modern man appears freer than at any point in history, uninhibited by rigid social hierarchies, unconstrained by material limitations that plagued previous generations. Yet beneath this veneer of liberation lies a profound contradiction. Men today are more emotionally dependent, more psychologically constrained, and more spiritually domesticated than perhaps at any other moment in human history. This domestication operates invisibly, not through physical chains or overt oppression, but through the subtle rewiring of male psychology. You've been taught that emotional vulnerability equals strength, that constant seeking of validation represents growth, that perpetual self-doubt signifies wisdom. What if these supposedly enlightened developments are simply more sophisticated forms of control? Locke understood something essential about human nature that we've forgotten. Authentic liberty isn't just freedom from external constraints, but freedom from psychological dependency. His concept of natural liberty wasn't merely political. It was a psychological state, where one's emotional well-being doesn't hinge on constant external validation, approval, or permission. The modern man has been conditioned to outsource his emotional stability, to require perpetual affirmation from others to maintain his sense of self. He's been trained to distrust his instincts, to question his every impulse, to filter his raw emotional responses through the lens of social acceptability. This isn't evolution or growth. It's domestication masquerading as enlightenment. What Locke feared was not just tyrannical governments but the colonization of the mind itself. The subtle ways in which men might surrender their psychological sovereignty in exchange for comfort, security, and belonging. He understood that true freedom begins not with political arrangements, but with internal autonomy, the capacity to exist emotionally independent of others' approval or validation. The first step toward reclaiming your authentic masculinity isn't political action or social reform. It's recognizing the invisible chains that bind you. It's acknowledging how thoroughly modern society has domesticated male emotional life, transforming what should be wild, independent, and self-sufficient into something dependent, uncertain, and perpetually seeking external validation. These chains weren't forged overnight. They're the product of decades of subtle social engineering, well-intentioned but misguided psychological theories, and fundamental misunderstandings about what constitutes genuine emotional health in men. The domestication has been so gradual, so seemingly benevolent, that most men don't even realize they're wearing these chains at all. John Locke, writing in the 17th century amidst political turmoil and the struggle against absolutism, wasn't merely concerned with governmental structures. His philosophical project cut deeper, to the very nature of human autonomy and what it means to be truly free. While he's remembered primarily as a political philosopher, Locke's insights into psychological liberty were perhaps his most prescient contribution. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke explored how our minds are shaped by experience, suggesting that we begin as blank slates, tabula rasa, upon which society and education inscribe their values. What he recognized, but what we've conveniently forgotten, is how this process can become a form of invisible coercion. When society inscribes values that systematically undermine male psychological independence, it performs a kind of emotional neutering that appears enlightened, but serves as control. Locke wrote, "The only fence against the world is a thorough knowledge of it." He understood that authentic liberty requires vigilance, not just against obvious tyranny, but against subtle manipulations that reshape our very understanding of ourselves. For Locke, true freedom wasn't merely the absence of external constraints, but the presence of internal sovereignty. What would Locke make of the modern man? He would see someone taught to doubt his own perceptions, to second-guess his own judgments, to filter his authentic reactions through the sieve of social acceptability. He would observe men who cannot trust themselves, who require constant external validation to feel secure in their identities, who have internalized the belief that their natural masculine instincts are inherently suspect and must be constantly regulated by outside authorities. This is precisely the psychological condition Locke warned against. He understood that political liberty means nothing without psychological autonomy, the capacity to trust one's own judgment, to rely on one's own emotional resources, to stand firm in one's own convictions, even when they run counter to prevailing opinion. The great irony is that we've achieved unprecedented political freedom while simultaneously surrendering unprecedented psychological sovereignty. We've thrown off the yoke of monarchs only to voluntarily don the collar of emotional dependency. We've rejected external censorship only to eagerly embrace internal self-censorship. We've denounced political tyranny while welcoming psychological subservience. Locke's vision of liberty was never merely about voting rights or representative government. It was about the capacity of individuals to govern themselves according to principles they understood and freely accepted. He believed in man's capacity for self-regulation without external enforcement, a belief that stands in stark contrast to the modern assumption that men require constant external guidance to manage their emotional lives. What we've forgotten from Locke's wisdom is that liberty is an internal state before it's an external condition. A man who cannot trust his own emotional responses, who requires constant validation from others to feel secure, who has been conditioned to doubt his every intuition, is not truly free, regardless of the political rights he enjoys. The domestication of the modern man operates through 4 primary mechanisms, each more subtle and insidious than the last. Together, they form a comprehensive system for transforming naturally independent male psychology into something dependent, docile, and perpetually seeking approval. First comes the pathologization of natural male emotional patterns. Throughout history, men have typically processed emotions through action, through periods of solitude, through indirect communication, and through humor. These natural male emotional rhythms have been systematically labeled as dysfunctional, replaced with a one-size-fits-all emotional template that demands verbal processing, constant disclosure, and performative vulnerability. What's presented as emotional growth is often simply the imposition of a foreign emotional language that leaves men perpetually feeling inadequate and unskilled. Second is the deliberate severing of men from their emotional heritage. Previous generations of men possessed emotional wisdom specifically tailored to male experience, ways of handling adversity, processing grief, managing conflict, and finding meaning that aligned with masculine psychology. This transmission of emotional knowledge has been disrupted, replaced with generic therapeutic models that often fail to address the specific emotional needs and patterns of men. Cut off from their emotional heritage, modern men find themselves adrift, with no internal compass to guide them through life's challenges. Third comes the cultivation of emotional dependency. Men are now taught that healthy emotional processing requires constant external validation, perpetual dialogue, and unending affirmation from others. Self-reliance, emotional stoicism, and private processing, traditional male strengths, are pathologized as isolation or repression. The result is a generation of men who cannot regulate their own emotional states without external intervention, who have essentially outsourced their emotional stability to others. Finally, there's the inversion of natural authority. Men have been conditioned to distrust their own perceptions, judgments, and intuitions, while deferring to external authorities on matters of their own internal experience. This represents the most complete form of psychological subjugation, a state where men no longer believe they possess the authority to interpret even their own emotional lives without external validation and permission. The consequences of this emotional domestication are profound. We see increasing rates of male depression, anxiety, and suicide across the developed world. We observe growing uncertainty among men about their roles, identities, and purpose. We witness the rise of extreme ideologies that promise to restore male dignity, precisely because mainstream culture has so thoroughly undermined it. What makes this domestication particularly pernicious is that it presents itself as liberation. Men are told they're being freed from restrictive emotional patterns, liberated from the constraints of traditional masculinity. But this supposed freedom is actually a sophisticated form of control, one that operates not through external force, but through internal conditioning. Locke understood that the most effective form of tyranny isn't one that crushes resistance, but one that makes resistance unthinkable. By reshaping how men understand and experience their own emotions, by convincing them to distrust their natural responses and defer to external authorities, modern society has achieved a form of control that no political despot could ever match. The path to authentic male emotional freedom begins not with rebellion against external authorities, but with the reclamation of internal sovereignty. It requires a fundamental reassessment of how you relate to your own emotional experience and a willingness to trust yourself in ways modern society has taught you to view with suspicion. First, recognize that emotional self-sufficiency is not pathology but strength. The capacity to process emotions independently, to find your own center without constant external validation, to weather internal storms through your own resources. These are not defects to be corrected, but virtues to be cultivated. The truly liberated man is not one who becomes increasingly dependent on others for emotional stability, but one who develops robust internal resources that allow him to engage with others from a position of choice rather than necessity. Second, reclaim your emotional heritage. Throughout history, men have developed specific ways of processing emotions, finding meaning, and building resilience that align with masculine psychology. These approaches weren't arbitrary or merely culturally imposed. They evolved because they worked with, rather than against, natural male emotional patterns. Study how men throughout history handled grief, joy, love, loss, and challenge. There's wisdom in these traditional approaches that modern therapeutic models often fail to capture. Third, develop discernment about which aspects of modern emotional discourse serve your authentic development and which serve your domestication. Not all contemporary ideas about emotional health are misguided. Many offer valuable insights and tools. The key is developing the discernment to distinguish between approaches that enhance your psychological sovereignty and those that subtly undermine it under the guise of helping you. Fourth, build communities of men who understand and support authentic male emotional development. The domestication of men has been facilitated partly by their isolation from one another, by the loss of male spaces where emotional wisdom specific to men could be shared and cultivated. Creating or joining communities where men can speak honestly, without constant self-censorship, about their emotional experiences is essential to reclaiming psychological freedom. Locke believed that liberty requires both vigilance and courage, the vigilance to recognize encroachments on one's autonomy and the courage to resist them. This applies as much to psychological liberty as to political liberty. It takes vigilance to recognize how modern emotional norms may be undermining your innate strengths, and courage to trust your own emotional instincts even when they run counter to prevailing wisdom. The revolution Locke envisioned wasn't merely about changing political structures, but about claiming the full measure of human dignity and autonomy. For the modern man, this means recognizing that true emotional health isn't found in increasing dependency or perpetual self-doubt, but in the development of robust internal resources, authentic self-trust, and the courage to define your own emotional path. What Locke saw coming wasn't just political tyranny, but the more subtle tyranny of a society that achieves control not through chains and prisons, but through the colonization of the mind itself. By reclaiming your psychological sovereignty, by trusting your emotional instincts, by developing your internal resources rather than outsourcing your emotional stability. You engage in precisely the kind of revolution Locke believed most essential, not merely the overthrow of external authority, but the establishment of true self-governance. The emotionally sovereign man isn't one who never needs others, but one who engages with others from a position of choice rather than dependency. He isn't emotionally isolated, but emotionally self-sufficient. He doesn't reject vulnerability, but chooses it authentically rather than performing it to meet external expectations. This is the true liberation that Locke envisioned, not mere freedom from external constraint, but the positive freedom to define and direct one's own life according to principles one understands and freely accepts.